I walked into that dealership with a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to have in nearly 6 years. It was a quiet, steady pride. For 2,000 days, I had been the one walking to the bus stop in the rain. I was the one who skipped dinners out, who wore the same 2 pairs of work slacks until the hems frayed, and who lived in a studio apartment that smelled faintly of old radiator steam and damp wood. I did it because I believed in the slow climb. I believed that if I just kept my head down and played by the rules, eventually, the world would open a door for me. That Saturday was supposed to be the day that door finally swung open. I had $7,000 and a cashier's check tucked into my breast pocket, the result of 3 years of overtime and skipped vacations. I just wanted a silver sedan. Nothing flashy. Just something that didn't require a bus schedule to operate. The showroom was bright, smelling of industrial floor wax and expensive espresso. It was crowded with families and couples, the air thick with the hum of people making big life decisions. I sat across from the finance manager, a man named Marcus, who wore a suit that cost more than my first 3 months of rent. He was smiling when he took my ID. He was even whistling a little tune when he started typing my information into his computer. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, thinking about how tomorrow morning, for the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't have to check the weather before I left the house. Then the whistling stopped. Marcus frowned at the screen. He clicked the mouse once, then twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. The smile didn't just fade, it turned into a look of genuine confusion, followed by a cold, clinical hardness. He didn't lean in to whisper. He didn't ask me to step into a private office. He just leaned back, tapped his pen against the desk, and spoke loud enough for the couple at the next desk to stop their conversation. He told me that there was no way he could help me. He said my application wasn't just denied, it was flagged. He looked at me like I was a common thief who had wandered into his pristine showroom to waste his time. I asked him what he meant, my voice cracking just enough to betray my sudden panic. I told him I had the down payment right here. He gave a sharp, dry laugh that felt like a slap. He said that $7,000 didn't mean anything when you had multiple active collections and a credit score of 340. He actually said the number out loud. 340. A woman standing at the coffee station nearby, draped in a designer scarf and holding a toddler's hand, actually scoffed. She whispered something to her husband about people trying to live beyond their means, looking at my worn shoes with a sneer of pure, unearned superiority. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, a deep, burning crimson that made my ears ring. I tried to explain that there had to be a mistake. I had never even had a credit card. I paid every bill in cash or by debit. I lived a ghost's life specifically so I would never owe anyone a dime. Marcus just slid a printed sheet across the desk toward me. He told me that the report didn't lie. It showed years of history. It showed defaults on high-end retail cards, a jewelry store line of credit that had gone to collections 2 years ago, and several personal loans I had apparently taken out and ignored. The Karen at the coffee station made another comment, louder this time, about how some people just have no shame. I didn't even look at her. My eyes were locked on the paper. I thought it was a mistake. A glitch in the system. Until I saw the primary address listed on the credit report. It wasn't my apartment. It was my parents' house. I sat in my car, the old, trembling wreck I had hoped to leave behind at that dealership, and stared at the steering wheel until the vinyl texture seemed to blur into a gray fog. My parents' address. Those digits were burned into my brain like a brand. It was the place where I had learned the art of going without. My entire childhood had been a masterclass in the word no. I remembered the cold bite of winter through the thin soles of the off-brand sneakers they bought me from the clearance bin, while my mother lectured me on the nobility of a frugal life. They used to sit at the kitchen table every Sunday night, surrounded by ledgers and coupons, performing what they called the family audit. They would sigh heavily, shaking their heads over the rising cost of eggs or the electric bill, looking at me as if my very existence was a luxury they could barely afford. I was conditioned to feel like a burden, a financial leak they were desperately trying to plug with their supposed wisdom and sacrifice. They told me there was no money for the state college I had worked so hard to get into. My father had looked me dead in the eye and said that life was about making tough choices, and they simply hadn't saved enough because they were too busy putting food in my mouth. I believed him. I felt a crushing guilt for even asking. I spent years working double shifts at a diner while taking night classes, watching my peers go to football games and spring breaks while I scrubbed grease off flat tops until 3 in the morning. All the while, my parents were suddenly flourishing. My mother started wearing gold jewelry she claimed was costume. My father bought a boat he said he got for a steal at an estate sale. They praised their own financial discipline, telling me that if I just worked as hard as they did, I might one day have a sliver of their comfort. I looked up to them. I thought they were the gold standard of responsible living. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The poverty I had lived in wasn't a product of bad luck or a struggling economy. It was manufactured. It was a stage play designed to keep me small and grateful while they fed off my future like parasites. They hadn't just denied me a car today. They had been harvesting my identity since the moment I turned 18. Every time I had skipped a meal to save a few dollars, they were likely swiping a card in my name for a steak dinner. Every time I walked to work in the rain, they were using my credit to stay dry and comfortable. The financial wisdom they bragged about was nothing more than a sophisticated form of cannibalism. I wasn't their son. I was their line of credit. I was the silent partner in a business I never signed up for, and business was booming. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking with a cold, focused rage that I had never felt before. I logged into the credit bureau's portal on my small, cracked screen, bypassing the summaries and the highlights. I needed to see the deep tissue of this betrayal. I pulled the full report. It wasn't one card. It was an entire empire built on my name. I sat in the dark of my studio apartment, the only light coming from the harsh, clinical glow of my laptop screen. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as I began to peel back the layers of a life I didn't know I was living. I had downloaded the full, comprehensive credit disclosure, a document that ran 30 pages long. It was a roadmap of a decade of deceit, meticulously planned and executed by the people who were supposed to be my primary protectors. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my second monitor. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see the math of my betrayal in black and white, stripped of emotion and family ties. I needed the numbers to tell me the truth that my parents never would. The first entry was a Platinum American Express. It had been opened exactly 1 month after my 18th birthday. The credit limit was $25,000. It was maxed out. I looked at the transaction history from 3 years ago. There were charges for high-end furniture, a series of expensive dinners in the city, and a recurring charge for a premium wine club. While I had been eating ramen over a plastic bin to save for my textbooks, someone was sipping a vintage Cabernet on my dime. I felt a sick twist in my stomach as I typed the balance into my spreadsheet. $24,982. Next came the retail cards. It was like a tour of every luxury mall within a 50-mile radius. A high-interest line of credit from a premium jewelry store showed a $5,000 balance for a diamond tennis bracelet. I remembered my mother wearing that bracelet to my cousin's wedding. She had told me it was a cheap knockoff she found at a garage sale. She had lied to my face while the interest was compounding in my name. Then there was the designer clothing store card, the electronics outlet card, and 3 different platinum cards from banks I had never even walked into. Each one was a jagged scar on my financial history. But the deeper I went, the darker it got. I found a line of credit attached to a secret second mortgage. They had used my social security number to co-sign a loan on a property I didn't even know existed, a small vacation cabin 3 hours north. They had forged my signature on documents that claimed I was a co-owner with a 6-figure income. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They hadn't just stolen a few $100s for groceries. They had leveraged my entire existence to fund a lifestyle they could never afford on their own. I spent 4 hours clicking through PDFs, my eyes burning from the blue light and the sheer weight of the information. I was meticulous. I added up every late fee, every over-limit charge, and every penny of the principal. When I finally hit the sum function at the bottom of my spreadsheet, the number that appeared made the air leave my lungs. $187,000. That was the price tag they had put on my head. That was the cost of 10 years of my life. It was enough to buy a house, to fund a doctorate, to start a business. Instead, it had been vanished into thin air, converted into depreciating assets and temporary comforts for people who watched me struggle and did nothing to help. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the apartment ringing in my ears. I felt like a ghost. To the banks, I was a high-spending, reckless debtor who couldn't be trusted with a silver sedan. To my family, I was a bottomless well of free money. I thought I had reached the bottom of the pit. I thought that knowing the dollar amount was the final blow. I was wrong. I started looking closer at the fine print of the account management screens, clicking on the tabs for secondary account holders and permissions. My blood went from simmering to absolute zero in a matter of seconds. I thought I knew the extent of the greed, but I hadn't seen the true depth of the betrayal. But then I looked at the authorized users list. My parents hadn't just used the cards, they had given them to my siblings as graduation gifts. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday with the spreadsheet printed and folded into the pocket of my jacket. It felt like a lead weight against my ribs. The house looked exactly the same, the manicured lawn, the fresh coat of cream paint on the shutters, the new SUV sitting in the driveway that I now knew was partially funded by a fraudulent loan in my name. The smell of roasting chicken hit me the moment I stepped through the front door, a scent that used to mean comfort, but now smelled like a trap. My mother was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she basted the bird, wearing the very diamond bracelet I had seen on the collections report the night before. My father was in his recliner, scrolling through a brand new tablet. It was a scene of domestic bliss built on the bones of my future. I sat through the first 20 minutes of small talk, listening to them drone on about the rising price of gas and how they were thinking of remodeling the guest bathroom. The irony was so thick I could nearly taste it. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out the whole spreadsheet yet. I just pulled out a single page, the one showing the maxed-out Platinum Amex. I laid it on the lace tablecloth, right next to the gravy boat. I kept my voice low and steady, a forced calm that took every ounce of my willpower. I told them I had received a weird mailer at my apartment and that when I went to buy a car, I was told my credit was ruined. I asked them if they knew anything about this account. My mother didn't even drop her spoon. She just glanced at the paper and let out a light, airy laugh, the kind she used when I was a child and had asked a silly question. She told me not to be so dramatic. My father didn't even look up from his tablet at first. He just said they had to do what was necessary to keep the family afloat during some lean years. He told me that since I was so successful and hardworking, I clearly didn't need the credit anyway. He said it was just a tool, and they had used it to ensure the family stayed in this house and that my sister could have the wedding she deserved. They spoke about it as if they had done me a favor, as if by ruining my financial life, they had given me the opportunity to prove how resilient I was. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. There was no remorse. No, we're so sorry, we'll fix this. There was only a chilling, casual entitlement. My mother actually reached over and patted my hand, telling me that family is about sharing burdens. She said that once I was older and had children of my own, I would understand that a name is just a name, but family is forever. They had convinced themselves that my identity was communal property, a resource to be mined until dry. They looked at me not as a person who had suffered, but as a disgruntled employee complaining about a policy change. I pulled the rest of the spreadsheet out then. I showed them the total. $187,000. I told them that this wasn't a burden-sharing exercise, it was a felony. I told them I needed them to sell the SUV, sell the cabin, and take out a loan in their own names to clear my debt within 30 days. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The forced warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold, jagged hostility. My father slammed his tablet onto the table, the screen cracking under the force. He stood up, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. He didn't offer a payment plan. He didn't offer an apology. When I told them to pay it back, my father slapped the table and said, "We gave you life. This is the interest." That was the moment I stopped being their child and started being their creditor. I didn't wait until I got home to start the counterattack. I sat in my car at the end of their driveway, the engine idling, and I systematically logged into every single account I had found on that report. My fingers were cold, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. One by one, I reported the cards as lost or stolen. I placed a total fraud freeze on my social security number. I changed the primary contact emails and the recovery phone numbers to my own. I watched the digital lights go out on their lifestyle in real time. I knew the fallout would be immediate, but I underestimated the sheer, unhinged velocity of their entitlement. The first notification chimed on my dashboard before I even reached the highway. It was the family group chat, a digital space usually reserved for birthday emojis and pictures of Sunday roasts. My sister, Sarah, was the first to strike. She sent a flurry of messages in all caps, claiming she was at a high-end department store with a cart full of bridesmaid gifts and her card had been declined. She called it a humiliating experience, blaming a technical error at first, until my mother chimed in. My mother didn't hold back. She told the entire extended family, my aunts, my cousins, even my elderly grandmother, that I had snapped and was trying to sabotage the family out of some misplaced childhood jealousy. The phone started vibrating incessantly in the cup holder. It was like a swarm of hornets had been released into the car. My brother, the one who had been using my credit for his investment lifestyle, sent a voice note that was nothing but screaming. He told me I was a selfish coward for leaving him stranded without a way to pay for his gas and his dinner. He actually had the audacity to ask how I expected him to get home. I didn't reply. I just watched the messages pour in. They weren't asking why I did it. They weren't asking for my side of the story. They were simply outraged that the faucet of free money had been turned off. To them, my identity wasn't mine. It was a public utility, and I was being a tyrant for wanting to control my own name. By the time I walked into my apartment, the war had moved to a public stage. My mother had posted a long, rambling status on Facebook. She didn't mention the $187,000. She didn't mention the identity theft or the forged signatures. Instead, she painted a picture of a troubled son who was suffering a mental breakdown and was lashing out at the parents who had sacrificed everything for him. She used words like betrayal and heartbreak, framing my demand for financial restitution as a greedy attempt to sue his own parents over a small accounting mistake. The comments section was a graveyard of my reputation. My Aunt Linda, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, called me a disgrace to the bloodline. A family friend wrote that they always knew I was the difficult one. People who had never seen my bank account or the inside of my studio apartment were suddenly experts on my character. They were all rallying around the saintly parents who were being bullied by their monster son. My mother even started a GoFundMe, claiming they needed help with emergency expenses caused by my unpredictable behavior. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. They were using the very community I grew up in to shame me back into silence, hoping that if the social pressure was high enough, I would simply unfreeze the accounts and go back to being their silent provider. I sat on my bed, scrolling through the vitriol. I saw my sister post a picture of herself crying, claiming I had stolen her joy right before her big day. I saw my father like every comment that called for me to be disowned. For a second, a small, weak part of me wanted to cave. I wanted the screaming to stop. I wanted to go back to being the invisible, good son who didn't cause trouble. But then I looked at my spreadsheet. I looked at the 340 credit score that Marcus, the finance manager, had announced to a room full of strangers. The social media smear campaign was working. My aunts and uncles were calling me a monster. So, I decided to give them a real reason to be afraid. I shut off the notifications on my phone, placing it face down on the wooden desk. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was necessary. If I was going to be the monster they claimed I was going to be a precise one. I opened the spreadsheet again, but this time, I wasn't just looking for totals. I was looking for the stories behind the numbers. I began a line-by-line forensic audit of the last 5 years of my life, the years I thought I was struggling alone, while my shadow self was apparently living like royalty. I started with the cash advances. This was the section that made my skin crawl. On a card opened 4 years ago, there was a series of $5,000 withdrawals, totaling $50,000 over 18 months. The location of the withdrawals? A casino 2 towns over from my parents' house. My father, the man who had lectured me on the dangers of impulse spending when I wanted a new winter coat in high school, had been gambling away my future on Saturday nights. I could see the dates. Some of those withdrawals happened on the same weekends I had called home, stressed about making my rent, only to be told they were praying for my situation. Then I found the travel expenses. This was the Disney trip the family group chat had raved about 3 summers ago. I remembered seeing the photos of my parents, my sister, and my brother standing in front of the Cinderella castle, all wearing matching t-shirts. They told me I couldn't come because the family budget was too tight to cover an extra person. I had spent that week working double shifts at the diner to cover a car repair. Now I saw the truth. The flights, the 5-star resort stay, the character breakfasts, and even those matching shirts, all $15,000 of it, had been charged to a travel card in my name. I was the one who paid for the vacation I was excluded from. I typed the entry into the spreadsheet: family exclusion event, $15,342.11. The petty cruelty didn't stop there. I found an $8,000 charge at a high-end cosmetic surgery clinic in the city. The name on the patient intake notes, which I managed to cross-reference through a billing portal, was my brother's. He had been balding since his early 20s and suddenly sprouted a full head of hair that he claimed was the result of vitamins and a better diet. No, it was the result of a follicular unit extraction paid for by my credit score. He was walking around with my retirement fund literally grafted onto his scalp. I felt a cold, hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest. It was so absurd it almost felt fake, but the interest charges were very real. I spent hours categorizing the greed. I created tabs for luxury goods, personal grooming, and entertainment. I attached digital copies of every statement, every forged signature on the digital applications, and every IP address used to log into the accounts, most of which traced back to my parents' home network. I wasn't just making a list anymore, I was building a cage. This was no longer a messy family dispute, it was a clinical, court-ready dossier of systematic financial destruction. I included the audit of sacrifice, a side-by-side comparison of my actual income and expenses versus the fraudulent ones. It showed me living on $22,000 a year while they spent $60,000 a year on my behalf. The total didn't change, but the weight of it did. It was one thing to see the number $187,000. It was another to see that $50,000 of it was lost at a blackjack table and $8,000 was spent on my brother's vanity. My parents hadn't just used my credit to stay afloat, as they claimed. They used it to fund the things they felt they were entitled to but were too lazy or too proud to earn. They had treated my social security number like a lottery ticket they had won by default of birth. As the sun began to peek through the blinds of my apartment, I reached the final section of the audit, the second mortgage on the cabin. I looked at the routing numbers and the banks involved. This wasn't just a local bank in our hometown. The mortgage had been processed through an out-of-state lender, and the funds had been wired across state lines to a title company in a neighboring territory. That's when the gravity of the situation shifted. Up until that moment, I had been thinking about small claims court or a local police report. I had been thinking about making them pay. But as I stared at the wire transfer records and the interstate mortgage fraud, the room felt very, very cold. I realized this wasn't just identity theft. Since they moved the money across state lines and used it to secure a fraudulent mortgage, this wasn't a local police matter anymore. The banging on my door started at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't a polite knock, it was the frantic, heavy-handed thudding of people who believed they still owned the person on the other side. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know it was them. The air in my hallway seemed to vibrate with their specific brand of frantic aggression. When I opened the door, I didn't pull it wide. I kept the chain on, peering through the 4-inch gap at the two people who had spent the last decade hollowed out my life. My father looked disheveled, his face a mottled shade of red, while my mother stood behind him, clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest like a shield. There was no inquiry into how I was doing after the public execution of my character on social media. My father immediately put his boot in the crack of the door. He told me to stop this insanity and open up. He said the bank had called about the freeze on the second mortgage and that the family home was now at risk of immediate foreclosure. He spoke as if I were a rebellious tenant refusing to pay rent, rather than the victim of his federal crimes. My mother chimed in, her voice high and trembling with a manufactured frailty. She said they had brought a document, a simple confession of judgment, that would state I had authorized the accounts, but had forgotten due to personal stress. She told me that if I just signed it, the debt would stay in my name, the bank would be happy, and the family could go back to being a family. I looked at the envelope in her hands. It was the physical manifestation of their ultimate plan to make me legally responsible for the $187,000 they had spent. They weren't there to apologize, they were there to finish the job. They wanted me to sign away the next 30 years of my life so they could keep their cabin and their SUV. My father's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. He told me that he didn't raise a traitor. He said that if I didn't open the door and sign those papers, he would make sure I never worked in this town again. He began to shoulder the door, the wood groaning against the security chain. The entitlement was so pure it was almost hypnotic. He actually believed that through sheer physical intimidation and fatherly authority, he could force me to commit further fraud to cover up his own. He started shouting about the golden child and how my sister's wedding was being ruined because the caterer's deposit had been bounced when I froze the cards. He tried to push past me, his weight straining the hinges, his breath smelling of stale coffee and desperation. My mother was nodding, urging him on, telling me to just be a good son and fix the mess I had made. I didn't move. I didn't push back. I just stood there in the shadow of my own home and watched them. I watched the people who had stolen my shoes, my college fund, and my reputation try to break into my sanctuary to steal the rest of my heartbeat. I felt a strange, detached sense of pity for them. They were so blinded by their own greed that they hadn't noticed the world had changed while they were busy playing saint. They thought we were still in the kitchen at the farmhouse, where their word was law and my silence was guaranteed. My father gave one final, violent shove, his face inches from mine through the gap. He demanded to know what I was waiting for. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I didn't even tell him to leave. I simply reached up and pointed to the small, blinking blue light of the Ring camera mounted on the doorframe, a device I had installed the very day I left the dealership. I told him that every word he had said, every threat he had uttered, and the document in my mother's hand had been recorded in high definition and uploaded to a cloud server. I didn't argue. I just pointed to the Ring camera and said, "Smile for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't look like anything on television. It was a sterile, quiet room that smelled of industrial carpet and stale air, tucked inside a nondescript building that most people drove past without a second glance. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my hands folded tightly on the table to keep them from shaking. Across from me sat Special Agent Miller. He was a man with graying hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every possible variation of human cruelty. He didn't rush me. He let me lay out my spreadsheet, the printouts of the fraudulent credit applications, and the recorded footage from my front porch. For 2 hours, Miller sat in total silence, scrolling through the digital trail of my life. I watched his face. I expected him to be bored, or perhaps to tell me that this was a civil matter I needed to handle with a divorce lawyer or a local precinct. Instead, I saw his jaw tighten as he reached the section on the second mortgage. He paused on the photos of the matching Disney t-shirts, then looked at the line item for my brother's hair plugs. He let out a slow, heavy breath and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He looked at me, not with the pity I had received from the dealership manager, but with a cold, professional respect. He told me that in 15 years of investigating white-collar crime and identity theft, he had rarely seen a case of familial fraud this systematic or this brazen. He used the word predatory. Hearing a federal agent use that word to describe my parents was the first time the fog of gaslighting truly lifted. For years, I had been told I was the problem, the mistake, the one who was too sensitive or too selfish. Miller didn't care about my family dynamics or my mother's heartbreak on Facebook. He only cared about the law. He confirmed that since the funds had moved through interstate banking systems and involved a fraudulent mortgage application, I was looking at a major felony. He walked me through the reality of the situation. He explained that my parents and siblings hadn't just borrowed money. They had committed bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He told me that his office had been looking for a specific pattern of fraudulent activity in this region, and my family had essentially provided the roadmap. It was the validation moment I had been starving for, the absolute, undeniable proof that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a monster for wanting to protect myself. I was a victim who had been picked clean by people who viewed me as an asset rather than a human being. The agent leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and looked me directly in the eyes. He warned me that if he moved forward with the investigation, there was no going back. There would be no family dinners or working it out quietly. There would be indictments, there would be handcuffs, and there would be a very public fall from grace for the people who had built an empire on my social security number. He told me he needed my formal signature on the affidavit to trigger the warrants. The agent asked me one question: do you want to protect your family, or do you want your life back? I didn't even have to blink. I was awake long before the sun touched the horizon on the morning of the reckoning. I sat in my kitchen, staring at a cold cup of coffee, watching the seconds tick by on the microwave clock. I knew the schedule. Agent Miller had been precise. At exactly 6 o'clock, the quiet, tree-lined street of my childhood would lose its carefully curated peace. I didn't have to be there to see it. The play-by-play came through my phone in the form of frantic, confused texts from Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor who had lived next door to my parents for 20 years and spent most of her time observing the neighborhood through her Venetian blinds. The first text arrived at 6:04 a.m. She asked if I knew why 3 black SUVs were parked horizontally across my parents' driveway. Then came the description of the flashlights, the heavy tactical vests, and the sound of the front door being breached with a single, authoritative strike. My heart didn't race. If anything, it slowed down. I felt a strange, hollow stillness. For a decade, these people had lived in a house built on lies, sleeping soundly while I lay awake wondering how I was going to pay for groceries. Now, the roles had finally, permanently reversed. Mrs. Higgins sent a blurry photo of my father being led out onto the porch. He wasn't the pillar of the community anymore. He was a man in mismatched pajamas and a stained undershirt, his wrists bound in heavy zip ties, his face a mask of sheer, unadulterated shock. Behind him, my mother was being escorted out by a female agent. She wasn't wearing her gold jewelry or her designer scarf. She looked small, frail, and terrified, the very image she had tried to use to manipulate the world into hating me. But the law doesn't care about optics. The law cares about the fact that her signature was on 3 different credit applications that she had no right to touch. The most satisfying part, the part that finally broke the last string of guilt I held, was the arrival of the 4th vehicle at my brother's apartment complex, just a few miles away. He was brought to the parents' house 20 minutes later for processing. He was being charged with conspiracy and receiving stolen property. Seeing him in the back of a squad car, the man who had used my identity to buy himself a new head of hair and a lifestyle of leisure, was the final receipt. He had spent years laughing at my struggles, telling me I just didn't have his hustle. It turns out his hustle was just a federal crime. The neighborhood watched from their windows as the agents carried out boxes of evidence, the laptops used for the wire fraud, the folders of family audits, and the luxury items that had been bought with my credit. The saintly family was being dismantled in front of the very people they had lied to for years. The social media facade, the GoFundMe pages, the public declarations of my instability, it all collapsed in the span of a single hour. They weren't being bullied by a monster son. They were being processed by the United States government for a systematic campaign of financial predation. I didn't feel the surge of joy I expected. I just felt clean. I felt like the air in my lungs was finally my own, no longer being filtered through their demands and their deceits. By noon, the local news was running a segment on a major identity theft ring involving a local family. The comments on Facebook shifted instantly. The aunts and uncles who had called me a disgrace suddenly went silent, or worse, started deleted their previous posts to avoid being associated with the fallout. The community that had been so quick to judge me was now falling over itself to distance themselves from the criminals. The silence of my phone was finally broken around 2 in the afternoon. It was a call from the county intake center. My father was allowed one call. He didn't use it to apologize. He didn't use it to ask for forgiveness or to check if I was okay. He used it to demand that I come down there immediately with a bail bondsman. He told me that, as a family, we needed to stick together and that I was the only one with a clean enough record to secure their release. They actually expected me to use my ruined life to save theirs one last time. They called me from jail, begging for bail money. I told them I'd love to help, but unfortunately, my credit score is too low. It has been exactly 1 year since the black SUVs turned my parents' driveway into a crime scene. The silence that followed wasn't the lonely, heavy silence of my childhood. It was a peaceful, expansive quiet. I spent months working with Agent Miller and the credit bureaus, filing the identity theft affidavits that slowly, painstakingly scrubbed the filth of my family's greed from my record. It was like watching a fever break. One morning, I logged into my portal and saw it. A 795. I sat at my desk and cried for 20 minutes. Not because of the number, but because for the first time in my life, I finally own my own name. I went back to that same dealership last month. Marcus wasn't there, but the air still smelled of that expensive espresso. I didn't need a cosigner, and I didn't need to explain myself. I handed over a down payment, signed my own name on a single line, and drove off the lot in that silver sedan. The engine was so quiet I could hear myself breathe. As for the people who shared my DNA, the no-contact order is the most valuable thing I own. My father is halfway through a 3-year sentence for wire fraud. My mother received 5 years of probation and a restitution order that will take her the rest of her life to pay back. My brother, the golden child with the stolen hair, lost his job and his apartment. He's currently living in a state-mandated halfway house, learning the hard way that you can't build a life on someone else's foundation. My aunts and uncles try to send me letters occasionally, talking about the importance of family healing and letting go of the past. I shred them without reading past the first sentence. They didn't care about healing when I was walking to work in the snow. They only care now because the family's reputation is in the gutter. People ask if I feel guilty for putting my parents in prison. I tell them, they didn't go to jail because of me. They went to jail because of their own signatures. If you want to hear how I took the house back too,